Here's part 2 of the lecture on robber barons, and in this part we're going to look at labor, the way that working people responded to the massive concentration of wealth in the hands of the robber barons. So, still lecture 17. One of the reasons why the robber barons moved so fearlessly to consolidate their power economically and politically was because national politics in the Gilded Age, from 1865 to 1895, were pretty much deadlocked. Between 76 and 92, we have what I call the lackluster milquetoast white bread mayonnaise presidents. Utterly forgettable, utterly boring presidents with no particular characteristics whatsoever. One of the things about this era of deadlocked, boring presidents is that there was no major push for reforms, such as, for example, lowering the tariffs. Whenever there was sort of like a major discussion about these issues, the parties were pretty evenly matched in terms of their control over Congress or the presidency. There was also widespread corruption, so it's easy to buy off politicians and basically get the policies that you want. No more than 1% separated the popular vote of the two major presidential candidates, except in 1892. So basically, the whole time of this period, Americans are 50-50 Republican-Democrat. And that gives none of the parties any sort of major sort of push to make changes that would dramatically reshape the economy. Some of the corruption extended to presidents, but more often than not, it extended to senators and congressmen, such as James G. Blaine, who used his influence in Congress to help the railroads. Letters were published in 1876 showing him using that influence, and he became nicknamed the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. Here he is with his tattoos of horrible, corrupt things that he's done. People pretty much picked one party or the other, and they stuck with it. There wasn't a whole lot of flip-flopping. So if you were a Democrat in this time period, you were a white supremacist Southerner probably. You were likely to be Catholic if you lived in the North, and maybe you were a recent Irish immigrant. Particularly immigrants of different religious backgrounds were attracted to the Democratic Party because that party didn't really make your religion a problem. It was the party of the urban working poor for the most part, most farmers, and then they were anti-tariff. If you were in the Republican side, you were probably a northern white and probably pro-business. Most African Americans are going to vote Republican because that's the party that ends slavery in the 19th century. Northern Protestant, pretty much only Protestants in the Republican Party. They tend to be anti-immigrant. They tend to be the party of the middle class, business folks, middle class entrepreneurs, and they tend to be pro-tariff. Once you picked one of these sides, it's pretty much a given that you will stick with this choice for the rest of your life because loyalty is deemed to be very important. It's like picking a team that you stick with. You can't be a fair weather fan in the 19th century. Not only was loyalty demanded, turnout was much higher. Today, less than 50% of registered voters actually go vote, but in 1876 it was 80%. Now it does drop over time, particularly as you get closer to 1900 and thereafter. Till about 1920, less than half of the population votes. Interestingly enough, voting is still very sectional. Democrats pretty much have the South at this time period. Republicans have the North, and then all of these green states are swing states. They can go one way or another depending on the candidate or how many people in that state may be on the Republican or the Democratic side. However, by the end of the 1880s and early 1890s, there was enough political power and interest in regulating the monopolies that we do see some attempts to rein in the worst abuses. And I say attempt for good reason. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, sponsored by John Sherman of Ohio. And it was supposed to regulate trusts and any combination that restrained trade. In other words, it's an anti-monopoly law. Because if you're restraining trade, then you are blocking competition. And that's not a good thing. Competition's good. Except when the first case of this act was brought before the Supreme Court in 1895, in the U.S. versus E.C. Knight case, the Supreme Court strangely ruled that sugar manufacturer E.C. Knight was not commerce and therefore could not be regulated by the Sherman Antitrust Act. Yeah, go puzzle that one because it makes very little sense. But this is the age of the dumb Supreme Court when they make some of their most boneheaded decisions. So the court ruled very narrowly that making sugar is not commerce, it's not a commercial activity at all, and therefore it couldn't be really regulated. And instead, strange twist, the Sherman Antitrust Act was then turned against unions and used to break up the power of unions because they were restraining trade. So it kind of puts us right back where we were before, with the robber barons, the fat cats sitting on their millions, living off of the sort of horrible conditions they imposed on their workers. You know, $9 a week, $11 a week, $6 a week. Meanwhile, they live on the backs of their workers. When times get rough, who drowns in the bad times? It's not the robber barons, it's workers. And that's going to set the stage for a showdown between labor and capital. So just to explain the working conditions and problems that workers face, just to make sure that it's very clear. Lack of job safety. You could be fired at any time for any reason. Lack of control over the job, particularly when jobs used to require a skill and now they don't. Workers are getting less and less control over the conditions of work. Low wages, because you can always hire a cheap immigrant. No support from the government, which some workers felt like the best thing could be that the government would completely stay out of the problem at all. Others wanted government involvement. Frequent economic panics. And when those happened, it hurt workers more than it hurt robber barons. A lack of a way to organize all the workers. We're going to see very much what that means in a few minutes. An increasing de-skilling of work, where work requires less and less knowledge and becomes more and more repetitive. And an ideological fear of communism and socialism. Whether workers were communist or socialist wasn't really an issue, but they get labeled communist and socialist, and all of a sudden they're bad guys. Usually by people who don't understand the definition of either communism or socialism. In 1900, we know that the average worker income was about $400 to $500 a year. The minimum income to be out of poverty was about $600. So most workers were living in poverty, while Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and Carnegie are sitting in their mansions, plural. Women made up about 17% of the workforce. in order to bring in enough income to keep their families, from starving to death. And children worked. 1.7 million of them worked primarily in agriculture and mostly in the South, and usually only part of the year. One of the ways that we can think about income in this time period is what the difference is between the real wages of workers, what their wages will actually buy, and what the actual income per person is. You can see that over the Gilded Age, average per capita income per person goes up. But that would also include the robber barons who are making quite a bit of money. The real wages of people, what they're actually able to buy with their income, doesn't go up as much as the overall income level does. So there's definitely a gap. And that gap widens as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. You can see once again that more and more people by 1900 and 1910 are involved in manufacturing and construction. So people are turning their attention away from farming towards factories, where conditions could be pretty brutal, as the case is for Sabina Goudet, whose hair got caught in the shaft and was whirled around and horribly mangled in the cotton mill that she worked in Putnam, Connecticut. Other people looked at the fact that children were working in the factories and said, it's the greed of the factory owners that forces these kids to labor for the money that their families need. But when workers try to organize and fight against the capitalists, they're often accused of being communist, of promoting socialist and communist ideas. And you might think, well, where are they getting this from? It's because Americans are watching Europe, and they're seeing what's happening in Europe in the 1860s and 70s, particularly in Paris, and places where industrialization has taken off. And they're seeing socialist ideas and labor disruptions, and Americans are coming sort of away from that with a picture that communism and socialism are inherently bad because they destroy education and law and order and rights and industry. One of the key developments of the time period is called Taylorism. As I said, working laborer sort of conditions were increasingly de-skilled over the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, in large part to Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was hired by numerous companies to go and watch the production in that company and then write down all the steps that he saw in the course of the production, and then come up with the most efficient way for those steps to be completed. His peak influence was 1910. He dies shortly after this, but his ideas live on. So the idea is essentially that you can divide any task into a number of small parts, and you can give that small part to any brainless oaf who can push a button, pull a lever, hit something, and do that all day long. It requires very little skill, almost no English. You just show someone what to do, and boom, you can fire all your educated workers and replace them with immigrants who are willing to work for cheap. Workers would learn the best way to do each part, and they would do that all day long. Because it required no skill, it increased production while also keeping wages low. Many workers looked at this as basically industrial slavery, wage slavery, and they compared it to the slavery of the past. Now the comparison is slightly off because African American slaves didn't have a choice. They were kidnapped from Africa. The wage slavery of the present was a choice, but it was not a very free and open choice. Because in many cases, it's the choice to either work under the conditions you would have to accept or starve to death. And a lot of the ideas coming out of Europe, the socialist and communist ideas, were emphasizing just how much the workers were on the bottom of the system, supporting everyone else in this capitalist world of industrial exploitation. As we will see in class, one of the ways they got across these ideas was through singing. And so as I teach you this song, this is one of the labor songs that would encourage people to think about their condition and understand what's happening to them, just in the same way as everybody throughout history has used music to sort of build a solidarity, a connection. And this is how the song goes. Is there aught we hold in common with the greedy parasite who would lash us into serfdom and would crush us with his might? Is there anything left to us but to organize and fight? For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving midst the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. And the chorus now. Solidarity forever, solidarity forever, solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. So there you go. You'll recognize the tune. Good old classic American song. And when workers sing this, they get the lesson. What's our choice? Organize. Because we are being crushed by the greedy parasite. But we did the work. We laid the railroad ties. We built the workshops. And now we're starving. How is that fair? Another one was 8 Hours, which I'm not going to teach you the melody for because this is a really terrible melody. But just look at it because this will explain to you what they want. We mean to make things over. We are tired of toil for naught, with but bare enough to live on and ne'er an hour for thought. We want to feel the sunshine and we want to smell the flowers. We are sure that God has willed it and we mean to have 8 hours. We're summoning our forces from the shipyard, shop, and mill. And the chorus goes, 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Repeat that. And this is where the idea for the 8-hour day comes from. My other favorite one, which I am going to teach you the melody to, is called The Future of America. You'll recognize this one. My country, 'tis of thee, land of lost liberty, of thee we sing. Land of the millionaires who govern our affairs, own for themselves and heirs, hail to thy king. Land where the wealthy few can make the many do their royal will, and tax for selfish greed the toilers till they bleed, and those not yet weak-kneed crash down and kill. My country, 'tis of thee, betrayed by bribery, of thee we sing. We might have saved thee long had we, when proud and strong, put down the cursed wrong that makes a king. So, classic tune, but now new words criticizing the millionaires and the greedy. Why should these fat cats have so much and all those mansions while the ordinary people are crushed? So, people organize into unions. Typically, the unions have several tools. One of them is collective bargaining, negotiating for wages and working conditions for every worker. This is different than the normal traditional practice in America, which is individual bargaining, also known as the liberty of contract, where a person has the right to go and negotiate for his own wage. Instead, the union negotiates for everyone's wage. If they don't get what they want, they can go on strike and refuse to work. They can boycott the product and call on the public to boycott the product. They can also lobby politically to get support of government officials. One of the problems, though, that unions face is how to organize. Do you organize everybody, or do you organize only people by what they do or what they make? One of the oldest forms of union activity is a craft union, which is organizing by skill. So if you know how to make iron, you might be in the iron making union or the cigar making union or whatever happens to be. But after the 1860s, lots and lots of people don't have a skill. So how are you going to organize them? Well, you make an industrial union, which organizes all people who work in that industry, regardless of if they have a skill or not. One of the earliest unions was called the Knights of Labor. It was an industrial union, so it organized all different kinds of workers. Started in 1869 by Uriah Stevens and famously led in the 1870s by Terence V. Powderly Donut. The goals were an 8-hour day, abolition of child labor because it lowered labor wages, and they opened up their membership to even women and African Americans, but said no to bankers, whom they considered parasites, lawyers, because they helped bankers, gamblers, because they stole money from hardworking people, liquor dealers, and people like that. At its peak, they have about 700,000 members in 1885 and 1886, and then they collapse after a strike that I'm going to talk to you about in a few slides. Here's a picture of a meeting involving the Knights, and you can see an African American has the stage. So they were quite a wide open group. Here's a charter for joining the General Assembly. Knowledge is power. The next group was called the American Federation of Labor. They organized in Columbus, Ohio in 1886. That's right, our town. They met in the downtown area, and they decided that they would make basically a craft union, meaning that they would be organized according to whatever skill that you have. So whatever skill, like typing or cigar making or iron making, you'd belong to the Iron Makers Union, the Cigar Makers Union. Their leader was Samuel Gompers. They demanded no government intervention in disputes with capitalists, because they basically said every time that government gets involved, it helps the capitalists. They wanted better wages, better working hours, better working conditions, Papa John's. They wanted skilled workers only, which meant they would not attract people who had no skills. Usually those folks would be the poor workers. A lot of them would be immigrants. It is the most successful union, and over time it continues to have a great deal of success. It's still in existence today. So with all this power of unionization, how do unions not get what they want? Well, the businesses could always replace the workers with cheaper immigrant labor, thanks to Taylorism. Those were called scabs. Businesses could go to courts and get injunctions to end strikes. For example, in the Pullman strike of 1894, when there was a wage cut, the Pullman company simply went to a court and got an injunction against the strike and forced the strike to come to an end. Unions could also be taken down by private police forces. Yes, in the 19th century, you could hire your own mercenary police forces. The most well-known would be the Pinkertons, who were hired in the Homestead Strike of 1892, which was caused by a wage cut, as most of the strikes are. And the Pinkertons went to war against the Union members, and an all-out pitched battle broke out, eventually calling upon the state of Pennsylvania to put down the fighting, which is another way that you could block unions being successful. You could mobilize federal or state troops. For example, in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which started after a wage cut. Meanwhile, the guy who issued the wage cut was building a mansion for his son that had gold fixtures in the bathroom. So ponder that. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 did several $1 million worth of damage, resulted in a lot of deaths. So the President of the United States simply pulled all the troops out of the South, ending Reconstruction, and used them to put down the striking workers. Troops were also used in the Homestead Strike of 1892. These were the Pennsylvania Guards. And then finally, unions could also be taken down by public opinion. When unions acted during strikes in ways that were seen as violent and inappropriate, the public would often come out against the union. Unions would be labeled radical, dangerous, even if the union actually had nothing to do with the violence at all. For example, in 1886, there was a bombing in Haymarket Square in Chicago. The bomb, we're not exactly sure who was thrown by, probably some radical anarchist, but lots of policemen and bystanders were killed. Unions got blamed for the violence, and this event, in fact, is what kills the Knights of Labor. As you can see, the labor violence is mostly confined to the north. So the red areas show where there's some form of labor violence. Big events appear: Homestead, the railroad strike, the Haymarket, the Pullman strike. You do have labor violence out west, particularly in areas where there are mines. Here's the aftermath of the Great Railroad Strike. Several $1 million worth of damage as workers destroyed railroads, engine cars. Here's a meeting calling for workers to gather at Haymarket. This is a very cool poster because it's also in German. Achtung, Arbeiter. Attention, worker. So that should tell you that there was some attempt to cross the language barrier among working folks, recognizing that not everyone spoke English. Here's an illustration of the bomb going off at Haymarket. Another illustration of the bomb going off at Haymarket. People blame the unions. They blame them, say they're radical and anarchists. Here's the execution of 4 of the anarchists from Haymarket. Very, very flimsy evidence against them. Just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's the battle at Homestead, where private Pinkerton troops broke out into a gun battle with the workmen at Homestead, which was one of Andrew Carnegie's plants. There was an assassination attempt on Andrew Carnegie's plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, who was one of the frickin' most evil managers of a plant there could be. He and Carnegie schemed together to cut wages and to, suppress worker activity, thus triggering a strike. Here's what Pullman made. Pullman was a railroad car manufacturer, and he made luxury railroad cars so wealthy people could travel on the railroad in style and in comfort. It's like riding first class on Delta. Pullman actually operated a whole town next to his factory. So the town was basically housing built by Pullman. It had a church and a market house and square and school. You basically rented from Pullman. You bought your supplies from Pullman. Sometimes when this happened in the United States, these little company towns wouldn't even have pay be handed out in dollars. They would be basically paid in company money. It's like monopoly money. And then you'd go and you'd spend your monopoly money at the company store, pay your rent in this monopoly money. It's like sort of like alternative currencies going on. Fighting broke out at Pullman as well, and then a court injunction ended the strike. And here's the president at the time, Grover Cleveland. In the end, although workers tried to organize, they had not quite the same resources as industrialists. Yes, they've got the hammer of the strike, but they're riding on a nag of poverty. When you face a monopolist who's magnificently armored, who's got the public in his back pocket, who can use the law and the government to get what he wants, it's very hard for these guys to win any of the battles.